Hi, everyone, and welcome to the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health Science Talk series as we celebrate our 30th anniversary. My name is Siona. I'm delighted to be your host today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our Science Talk showcase the diverse, policy relevant, and interdisciplinary research of UNU-INWEH and our global network of experts. These sessions are designed not only to share cutting-edge science, but also to explore how it applies to real-world solutions for water, environment, and health challenges around the globe. Today's session, like all of our talks, is being recorded. The video will be made available in an open access format following the event. And you can find recordings of all our previous science talks on demand via our website and YouTube channel at unu.edu/invest/science-talks. We're also pleased to continue offering YouTube live streaming, making it easier for everyone to join our science talks. There is no need to register to watch live. Simply go to the UNU-INWEH YouTube channel and click on our profile picture to access the stream. As always, we'll conclude with an interactive Q&A session. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any point during the presentation, and we'll address as many as possible towards the end. Today's science talk is entitled Feeding the Future, Navigating Climate Change, Inequality, and the Water-Energy-Food-Environment Nexus. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi. Professor Mabhaudhi is Executive Director of the UNU Hub on Resilient Environment, Agriculture, Climate, and Health for Africa, REACH-AFRICA, at the University of Pretoria. And he leads the Water, Energy, Food, and Environment Nexus program here at UNU-INWEH, where he's helping establish the UNU-INWEH African Academy on Water, Environment, and Health. He's also Professor of Climate Change, Food Systems, and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Director of the Institute for Natural Resources in South Africa. He's a globally recognized researcher and science advocate and works at the interface of science, policy, and society on the complex challenges facing global food systems and climate change, environmental degradation, and growing social inequalities. In this science talk, he will draw on the water, energy, food, environment nexus approach to explore how interconnected solutions, inclusive governance, and collective action can address the pressures threatening our food security, our nutrition, health, and livelihoods. And he'll also highlight pathways to move beyond fragmented approaches towards more resilient, more sustainable outcomes for people and the planet. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mabhaudhi for today's science talk. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm going to give a brief talk on work that is ongoing. It's been ongoing for a while now. And basically, it has culminated in a new vision for a future food system, trying to shift away from the current food system and the challenges that it has. So we understand that the global food system is unsustainable, and that there are significant challenges with the global food system as it currently is. And in a lot of ways, it is driving unsustainability environmentally across the human sphere. There is increasing malnutrition. There's increasing biodiversity loss. It is also one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And it is also a major contributor to livelihood inequalities and worsening livelihood outcomes, especially in the global south. On the other side, it is also the most impacted system by global environment change and is heavily affected by issues such as droughts, floods, heat waves, as well as socioeconomic shocks and geopolitical shocks. So not only is it a driver of unsustainability, it is also an impact area of insustainability on the other side. So how do we then start thinking or rethinking the role of the food system, where it is not a driver of unsustainability, and it is also not vulnerable to these environmental shocks? Now, part of it is what we are doing in terms of rethinking the food system, not just from a food perspective, but from an outcomes-based perspective, where we are saying it should center on people, it should center on the planet, and it should center on equity, and revisioning it from the understanding of that food is powerful. It can contribute to human health and environmental health. It has economic contributions, and it has cultural aspects to it. So we should also factor in cultural appropriateness when we're considering this future food system. Also understanding the power of food then, because of its far-reaching implications, to be a driver of positive change. And how then do we balance society, environment, and economy, and also reconsider power relationships because of those imbalances that I mentioned, so that we have an ethical system that produces benefits for all, particularly for people and the planet. And how do we then harness our research and knowledge across key dimensions of water, energy, food, environment, and health, so that we better understand these trade-offs, but importantly, we are able to catalyze and make the most out of the synergies, which are the positive outcomes that can come together when we work across systems. Now, just coming back to some of the initial thinking around what I first mentioned about, how the current food system is damaging the earth or is damaging the planet. We know for certain that agriculture is responsible as a major driver of land use change, biodiversity loss, and deforestation. We know for certain that food systems are one of the major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. We also know for certain that beyond this, it is driving other forms of environmental degradation with huge environmental impacts and huge environmental costs. So there is a negative aspect to the food system in its current state and how it is currently positioned. And that's because of the global architecture of the food system, which is more production-centric, more efficiency-centered. So it's more input, high output, and therefore it is driving a very extractive agenda that is unsustainable for both the planet and the people, which then compromises human and environmental health at the end of the day. In doing so, it is important for us to understand and map this crisis. We know for certain that at least 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been exceeded. And of these, at least 5 of those, food systems are a major driver of those thresholds being breached. So again, that unsustainability and crisis driving aspect of the current food system as it is organized is creating crisis across the environment, it's creating crisis across social and economics, and then it's creating crisis across nutrition and health for people. It's also creating issues that relate to social justice and climate justice, because we know that most of the people who work in the food system earn below the living wage, and also they are exposed to pesticides and other things, and the damage that happens to the environment overall has significant implications on their well-being. And this straddles areas of human health and nutrition. It straddles the economy and livelihood. It straddles culture and communities. So there's a lot that is not right in terms of the exploitative, unfair, and unjust nature of the current food system as it is set up from that perspective. And it is just understanding why we need to have a new vision for a food system that works for all, that works for the people, that works for the planet, and that leaves no one behind. We also understand from our research that these issues are cross-cutting. And they are cross-cutting not just across natural systems themselves, when we think of water, energy, food, environment, and health. They are also cross-cutting across infrastructure. They are also cross-cutting across economics and livelihoods. And they're also cross-cutting across politics, or what we call the political economy. So rethinking and reshaping a new vision of a food system that addresses the imbalances, that addresses the unsustainability, that addresses the inequality, the lack of equity, and climate justice requires us to think in a systems manner and across human and natural systems, so that we come up with coupled solutions that address these challenges and also that are inclusive in nature and by design. So what are we proposing and what are we talking about? We're talking about a food system that is designed for people and the planet, a food system that works for both people and the planet, and that is underpinned by principles of equity, inclusion, integrity, accountability, that addresses the issue of fair livelihoods, that builds climate resilience, that sustains and promotes biodiversity, that contributes positively to human health and nutrition. So those are all the things that we would want to come out positively within this vision of a new food system. And again, it calls for us to be able to work across human and natural systems and across scales so that we achieve the sort of change that we are wanting. A major prerequisite for achieving this change or transformation is unlearning. So we need to unlearn certain things that have led us to this point so that we can learn new things. And that's why we are saying that for us to move forward, there is a major step of unlearning. So we need to shift from silo-based systems or just a food-based narrative that does not consider other elements, whether they are natural or in the human space, and move towards more of knowledge co-production, transdisciplinarity, systems leadership. We also need to move towards decolonizing food systems thinking so that we appreciate and celebrate the diversity that in the culture that food represents, the place, the people, the uniqueness of people in different spaces and places, the uniqueness of different foods and practices and diets, and allow those to manifest and strengthen local food systems where they exist, and move away from a global system that tries to cascade down to national, a top-down approach, but focus more on strengthening those local systems and scaling them into a more diverse global system. This requires us to reframe the knowledge systems that we have and shift them from a global to a local to global solutions, and to also shift from a silo or linear approach of understanding food systems or an output or efficiency centered approach to food systems to an outcomes-based approaches to food systems, where we then focus on what are the outcomes that we want food systems to achieve for both people and the planet, and then measure those outcomes instead of measuring the inputs and efficiency of use of inputs. We also need to highlight and profile Global South leadership, because there are many positive solutions and many positive lessons that emerge from the Global South, but often are not amplified strongly enough for them to get the scaling support they need, the financial support they need, and also the adoption that they need. So we also need to center or repivot or shift the center of knowledge to the Global South and amplify that. And I'll speak to that again a little bit later. And what then becomes our mandate as researchers and scientists, we need to go beyond the generation of rigorous and robust evidence, and think more in terms of where do we want to end up, what do we want to foster. And we want to foster systems thinking over silo thinking. We want to foster transdisciplinarity because that is where transformation exists. We want to be able to support and inform policy and decision making, and we want to be able to build human and institutional capacity. So that means as researchers, we have to be able to work across the science, the policy, the practice, and society, integrating all of these as we co-create, co-design, co-implement, and evaluate these solutions in an iterative process. So the continuous learning and being part of a learning organization. We are living in a world where we now have AI, and we cannot ignore, that there is AI. And whilst there is still ongoing debate around, the meaning of AI, its implications on human society and structure, there are positives to leveraging AI to drive food systems transformation and moving from reactive observation to more of a transformative approach and bridging the science policy practice gap. For example, AI could assist us or facilitate the acceleration of evidence synthesis across fragmented disciplines. So when we talk water, energy, food, environment, and health, it could help us to better synthesize knowledge across those fragmented disciplines. It could help us to better integrate climate, food, and environment data streams into more meaningful knowledge products. It could also enable real-time scalable decision support and also support anticipatory and adaptive policymaking, all of which would contribute to bridging the science policy practice gaps. So overall, the take-home message is in AI, if deployed responsibly and ethically, it could help shift food systems from being reactive to being more anticipatory and also to being transformative. But it requires responsible and ethical deployment of the AI. One of the things that we also have to think about, and in terms of rethinking and rebalancing, is how do we move from the old paradigm of capacity development to a new paradigm of capability strengthening? As I mentioned earlier in my previous slide, we are not just thinking about human capacity or capability or institutional capability. We are thinking more of societal capability and transformation. For the longest time, we were focused on capacity building and development. And this was fine in an era where we could assume that there is no capacity and therefore we needed to build and develop. But society has since transformed, and in many places in the global south, the capacity now exists. What lacks is the opportunity for those capabilities to be deployed in the right contexts where the skills can be matched to the need and supported with the right institutional partnerships and networks that enable those capabilities to actually achieve impact on the ground. So we are calling that capability strengthening because it brings in context, it brings in place, it brings in networks, it brings in partnerships as enablers and shifting away from the individual to more of a societal or a systems-oriented approach to how we do this. And this vision and this thinking is what we've brought into the UNU Hub on REACH-Africa. So in the UNU Hub on REACH-Africa, which is a critical driver for this vision that I've just been explaining to you, we are not only focusing on research and education and policy, we are wanting to go beyond to understand the systems. We are wanting to go beyond to provide an Africa-centered framing, to amplify the African message, and to work within a planetary health context the people and planet perspective, which I mentioned. Our objectives, again, are to drive major research programs, such as this one on the new food system vision, and the capability strengthening across systems and building a new cohort of systems leadership across Africa so that we can lead and facilitate policy engagement and evidence translation for impact. Now, some key takeaway messages around, how do we move or how do we start to catalyze the real world implementation of this new food or this new future food vision. We need to establish integrated food systems governance. A lot of failure happens in the governance space, so it has to be a major area of focus for us. A lot of issues of equity and inclusion and meaningful participation can be addressed at the governance level. So we need to establish integrated food systems governance. We need to scale climate resilient food production, matching it to environments, matching it to crops, and matching it to the people and the culture in terms of considering cultural appropriateness. We need to focus on healthy and affordable diets, not just calories. Last week, the FAO launched the 2026 State of Food Insecurity report. And whilst it reported progress globally in terms of reducing hunger, it flagged a key issue in that the cost of a healthy diet was increasing, and that in many places, especially in the global south, healthy diets remain unaffordable. So we cannot achieve the outcome of nutrition and health for all and for everyone if we cannot ensure access to a healthy and affordable diet. We need to embed equity and social justice into how we design our systems so that there is meaningful participation, not tokenistic participation, but meaningful participation and engagement across all levels of society, especially in the communities that bear the biggest brunt of the environmental, social, and food system crisis. And to do so, we need to accelerate in investment in people and institutions that can drive these 4 areas of change. So to wrap it up and bring it to conclusion, we are calling for a transformation of food systems through a planetary health approach that is grounded in local solutions, systems leadership, and transdisciplinary collaboration. This new shared future food system requires that we move beyond production, a focus on production, to building food systems that focus on delivering health, sustainability, equity, and resilience for people and the planet. I think that's the end of my talk, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Mabhaudhi, for the incredibly rich presentation. We'll now move into our Q&A segment. A reminder to our audience that you can drop your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll walk through as many as we can in the time that we have. My question for me would be, you've spoken about decolonizing food systems thinking, and yet there are a lot of philanthropic and donor capital flowing from the outside, and they still mirror colonial era practices and like power structures. When it comes, especially through earmark funding, what does decolonizing food system thinking actually look like in practice? And how concretely should funders rethink earmarking if they're serious about shifting that power dynamic?
Decolonizing, thanks. That's a very powerful question. Decolonizing food systems is, again, it's a systems process. It's not one action. It's a set of actions that we need to be purposeful and intentional about. Part of it is first recognizing the value and contribution of local systems, and the knowledge that local and indigenous peoples have that they've preserved, and valuing it to say this is important. What indigenous people have been doing, the way they have been preparing their food, the foods they eat, they are important food. And we should not have those foods at the periphery of the food system, but we should bring them in. When you talk about diversification, that should be form part of the diversification. It's not just about diversifying the plate, it's also about the diversity of the culture, the peoples who represent that plate. So that's an important perspective. And it's also important for us as researchers and scientists to support a narrative, a scientific narrative that actually provides the evidence base, so that it's not just advocacy that is saying that local foods are good and so forth. We need strong and robust evidence that actually confirms that local diets, local food systems are actually not just healthy for people, they also emit less emissions because of the shorter supply chains. They are more democratic because of the localization. They are more inclusive and have greater equity and balancing of power. And to build that case from the bottom up. And then the role of their institutions that then have a role to play in translating this now into the policy space. So first is the evidence generation. Then the next is how do we then translate this into the policy and decision-making space so that we start to inform decisions and policies to reflect these local values and the change on the ground. And if we get to that level of getting the policies at national and regional levels to reflect that, we can then get into the space now globally of trying to influence the philanthropies, the funders, and so forth, because ultimately they have to respond to and support what the need on the ground, what the national priorities are. We have lost the game because the colonial agenda of the food systems kind of set that global agenda and got it to cascade downwards. So the local voices were lost. So bringing those voices back up and reframing from local to global is critical to the decolonization agenda.
Thank you so much for listening, Mabhaudhi. This is a very powerful answer. Kind of just to follow up on what you said about global agenda. Last month in New York, United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs hosted a high-level political forum where ministers from the member states reviewed 2 SDGs that are relevant to today's talk: SDG 6, water and sanitation, and SDG 7, clean and affordable energy. And even though there were conversations that there are linked, the SDGs are linked and there are interlinkages and synergies, they're still being reviewed in silos, in separate silos. What it takes, or what is the biggest institutional barrier you think exists that still allows us to keep reviewing and funding water and energy environment in separate silos, and what it takes to move towards from fragmented to actually integrated policy approach?
I think the gap is really a lack of systems leadership. We do not have sufficient leaders who think beyond the desk that they are sitting on. So whilst the science might be advocating towards integration with strong evidence demonstrating that outcomes are enhanced, gains are multiplied when you work across systems. But at the table where decisions are then made, we still lack that systems leadership that is able to then integrate across and bring that evidence to bear in practice. So we've got that knowledge implementation divide, and I think it's more a call for greater systems leadership in terms of how we respond. There is a recognition that the current way of trying to solve global challenges is inadequate and that we need more integration. But the challenge is always the implementation. because even the SDGs were designed as an integrated set of goals meant to be implemented synergistically. But when we got to the implementation, there were no clear enough mechanisms and no clear enough leadership to then translate the intentions into practice. So people then championed them individually, and the synergies that were meant to be there got lost again.
Professor Mabhaudhi, I'll now open the floor to questions from the audience. Yes, Abraham.
Thank you for the insightful presentation. I have a series of questions, but I'll start with this one. I've always said that there's inequality displayed in most grocery shops, and what you pick determines your income. And most times it's out of distribution, interest, and what we want to cultivate. So how will you ensure that inequality is minimized in this framework or this system of food security or food production that you want to pioneer?
So that's a major issue, which I also flagged and which was flagged in the State of Food Insecurity report, that healthy diets remain unaffordable to the majority of people. We know that fruits and vegetables are nutritious, but those are the most expensive food group to purchase if you walk into a supermarket. In Africa, there's a chronic lack of animal sourced foods, and that is the most expensive food group for people to purchase. So part of it is then, if you understand that, we need to target interventions around those particular food groups. We need to have targeted interventions and shift the subsidies, stop the subsidizing of cereal staples, of legume staples, because their contribution to the diet relative to the cost of procuring them, there is a significant mismatch. So they are much cheaper to access than they are needed or significant in your diet. But those that are significant and needed are more expensive. But if we were to, for example, shift the subsidies or the global system of subsidies towards these, even in poor places such as Africa, you will find that governments in their agricultural schemes and support policies will prioritize maize, they will prioritize cassava, and so forth, the starchy crops. And ultimately, that ensures a lot of supply and low price for that. They will not prioritize fruits and vegetables. They will not prioritize proteins and alternative sources of proteins. So there's a policy step change that is needed to increase or to improve the affordability of healthy food options. Equally, there's also a policy step change that is needed to bring into the food system space underutilized indigenous and traditional crops that are nutritious, that are locally available, but that have just been lost because we stopped looking at them, we stopped valuing them as a source of food. In some instances, we stigmatized them as poor people's crops, so people are no longer making use of them. So if we do away with the stigma, if we re-promote them as healthy and superfoods, that brings in another group of accessible and affordable healthy foods.
Thank you. You have another one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this insightful response. So we also know the food space is defined by several conflicts and interests. And I remember our last conversation on animal rearing. And in Africa, most times there are conflicts between food crop production or producers and animal rearers. You also mentioned skill. And to me, power is embedded across these skills. How will you bring on board these interest groups? And the skill you are trying to operationalize, will it be based on interest, geographic zone, or function?
So the scale is important. So that's why I spoke about strengthening local food systems. So you'd be looking at geography. And when it comes to food system, geography then overlaps with function at that scale, because you're looking at agroecological zones that present, suitability for a certain range of crops and livestock and so forth. So the two would overlap in practice. So if you focus at that, strengthen the governance at those local levels, and then you scale from there, going, either vertical or horizontal, it's much easier to find harmony and balance. Part of the clashes that happen are mostly because of, I like to call it policy scale mismatch, that you've got these policies that are made often at a national level and often in alignment with global policies and what is called global best practice, but they don't reflect the local context, how people are actually living their lives, how they are engaging with the food system, where they are in that reality. So that often foments some of the issues that bring in this conflict, because then you'll find maybe government will say we are supporting a program of expanding production of cereal crops, which then translates into opening up new land, which, coincidentally might have been grazing land or grasslands, which are now being converted to become arable. And immediately that puts, pastoralist communities in conflict with those that are in cultivation and so forth. So it's usually those top-down policy implementation gaps that lack context that create or foment some of this conflict.
Thank you.
Another question from the audience, Miriam.
Thank you so much for another really interesting presentation. On your point about the challenges of moving towards policy implementation and this mismatch between costs and subsidies, do you think something like a nutrition label that takes into account how far something has traveled, or how much energy or land has been used to produce that food, do you think that would help raise awareness about these issues?
So that is actually something that is being talked about and being implemented with ongoing research around labeling, front of food labeling, making certain information, upfront for consumers. But that only has a greater impact on affluent consumers who have the power of choice to say, I've reached that stage where I've achieved the consciousness to say I want to consume sustainably. So I'm not going to eat that. It would be me saying I don't take almond milk because it is a huge, environmental footprint. So I take oat milk. But if you are still at the survival stage where affordability is key, it doesn't matter what it says on the front of the product. It's the price that informs your choice when you get into the shop. So whilst those mechanisms are important, they have to be supported by structural interventions that lower the actual cost of the product.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Now we have a question in the chat from Cynthia. In Canada, many Indigenous and Arctic communities are experiencing interconnected challenges related to water, climate change, food security, and health. How might the Nexus approach help policymakers address these issues in a more holistic way?
I think I would frame the question in the opposite way, to say, how can the Nexus learn from how communities, especially Indigenous communities, have been addressing interlinked challenges? Because whilst for the longest time, we as researchers have been studying these systems separately, the lived experience of people is not separate, because things occur in the same space and time. So you find that in a lot of these Indigenous communities, they have long found ways of managing these complex issues, because they've long been dealing with drought, floods, high temperatures, disease, poverty, lack of opportunity, intersecting with their daily lives and the decisions that they have to make on a day-to-day basis at a household nexus level, making the decision between paying for an energy bill or buying food, healthy food, or just basic food, sending a child to school. So I think in that regard, there is a lot that we could actually learn from how they've been managing these complexities at a local level. And that goes back to where I was saying that part of it is us unlearning the aspect where we think we've got solutions that we can bring into certain spaces, and rather take an approach that says there could be solutions in these places that we could help amplify and take to other places.
Thank you, Professor. We still have time for a couple more questions. Reminder to our audience that you can drop it in the chat. Anyone in the room has a question? If you allow me, then I'll ask another question. So what you spoke about kind of reminds me of the problem of the wicked problem in policy. So climate change is one, food security is another one, where one intervention creates trade-offs in somewhere else in the system. So can you give an example of where Nexus Lands changed how a country or institution decided where to intervene first and how that prioritization happened? Any example from a case study, a country, region?
Okay, so I'll give you the context in Africa, where I work. Because of this hunger issue that I've mentioned, and the fact that it has been increasing and for the longest time, a greater focus of government has always been food security. And the decisions on food security have always been overriding in terms of everything else, especially when it comes to environmental issues and environmental concerns. So in the process of driving food security, we have driven some of the largest land use change in history. We have driven some of the largest biodiversity losses in history, increased greenhouse emissions. A lot of evidence demonstrates that a major source of greenhouse gas emissions in the African space is land use change, and that is mostly driven by agriculture. But now what a Nexus lens is helping government do is to balance their need to drive food security with considerations for saying what is actually the natural land use that is happening in that place. What are we changing from to? Is there water? If we are saying, so for example, South Africa in its National Development Plan initially set a target of expanding the area under irrigation by 500,000 hectares. They wanted to add an additional 500,000 hectares. That figure has since been revised downwards to something less than 150,000 hectares. And those revisions were mostly based on matching the ambition with water availability and energy availability to pump and distribute that water, as well as taking into consideration natural and protected lands, which may have been initially assumed as idle land available. So a rethinking from a Nexus perspective led to a revision of a national target in a national development plan. And you're getting cases of that happening in different countries as they rethink some of their national planning goals and targets.
Thank you, Professor Mabhaudhi. Time for one more question, Miriam.
Thank you so much. I'm curious about your thoughts on genetic modification, and you're talking about sort of top-down approaches and concentration of power in a few nations. And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts, because it seems to me that there's a lot of risk. You know, countries in the European Union have banned certain types of GMOs, and I know there's a big debate around it. But from the context of nutrition and being able to support development, there have been some benefits to, for example, golden rice that has that's been modified to increase beta carotene to help deal with child malnutrition. So how do you distinguish between something that is, environmentally or socially potentially beneficial and some types of genetic modification that just kind of serves to concentrate the power in the hands of a few companies?
I think you pretty much answer yourself in asking the question that it's about equity, it's about inclusion, and it's about power. So, and I think the conflict is when you take power away from people, and this is where the conversation on food sovereignty comes into. A major clash or area of conflict between the GMO agenda is around the food sovereignty, the right of people to choose and determine their food system, what they want to grow and eat, versus a global agenda that says we shall all eat wheat, maize, soybeans, and potatoes, because these are the ones that are improved, that offer the greatest prospects of producing high yields under different environments. And so that's the conflict, really, that the GMO agenda is often perceived to clash with national and local interests, which prefer greater diversity and diversification on the field and on the plate versus this. And I think if it is matched with local interests, if you go into areas and the breeding responds to what people are trying to grow, and you identify some of the local crops that people are trying to produce, but are struggling to produce them under some of the changing environments, or they face low yields or yield instability. And we focus on improving those crops. For example, crops such as Bambara groundnut, crops such as teff, leb, winged bean, and so forth, that are nutrient dense, socially acceptable, and that also allow smaller groups of people to come into the food system, that rebalancing of power, and be producers and so forth. It becomes a different conversation. It also becomes a conversation of who owns the rights, because if the rights to these crops or these improved varieties are owned by large conglomerates that are often almost always in the global north, then that means those people have the power to control what is happening there. And God forbid if what we learned during COVID happened, where a decision had to be made to say who gets the most vaccines. And those who owned the IP obviously chose themselves first. So those are the bigger, more existential questions, that if there was a crisis, those who own the seeds, those who own the technology, they would choose themselves first. So why not invest in more local and more locally driven solutions and so forth? So I think that's the whole, from where I sit, the major conflict around GMs as a whole. Of course, there are the ethical, debate around, are they safe in the environment? What is the wider environmental impact of growing them in spaces that, are still very much natural and undisturbed? Would they fit in diverse agro-ecosystems that are not monocropped, where it's not just one stand of crop, but you've got different crops in there? Would there be any pollution or contamination of the other crops? Those are a separate set of questions that can be answered through science.
Thank you.
Professor Mabhaudhi, thank you again for such a thought-provoking talk and for engaging so genuinely with our audience's questions. Please, everyone, allow me to join me in thanking Professor Mabhaudhi for his time presentation today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
This brings us to the end of today's UNU-INWEH Science Talk. If you enjoyed the session, remember that all our previous talks are available on our website and YouTube channel at unu.edu/INWEH/science-talks. Feel free to revisit them or share them with your networks. We'll be back next week with another exciting presentation exploring new ideas at the intersection of water, environment, and health. Thank you, Professor Mabhaudhi.
Cheers.